Hello! In this short video, we would like to present you our new article published by Regulation and Governance. My name is Almut Schilling-Wackerflor and I currently work as a postdoc at the University of Osnabrück.
Hello, also from my side. My name is Andrea Lencho and I'm Professor of European Politics at Osnabrück University. In our study, we analyze ongoing policymaking processes at European Union level to adopt new regulations that aim to hold corporations into account for the negative impacts caused by the global supply chain. More specifically, we focus on the emergent regulation on forest risk commodities and the second, a cross-sectoral directive on human rights and environmental due diligence. On the one hand, our research points to an impressive dynamism within the EU and EU member states to adopt new regulations building on the new due diligence approach. But on the other hand, we also identify persistent challenges that need to be addressed for realizing their full potential. Let me give you a bit of background to our research, suggesting why it's interesting and also normatively important to look at the dynamics and potential of these ongoing EU legislative activities. Despite some contradictions between its own rhetoric and actual policy, the EU is often discussed as a normative power and leader in pushing efforts towards sustainable development and human rights at the global level. International regimes, for instance on climate change, have advanced not least due to the EU's active role. However, international environmental and human rights norms often suffer from a lack of enforceability and thus fail on the ground. With respect to the EU polity itself, the EU has also succeeded in developing a comparatively progressive environmental acquis and benefits from actually enforceable legislation. Despite certainly justified discussions about certain implementation gaps, and despite visible ups and downs in the EU's environmental ambitions, we suggest that the EU does stand out as a progressive force in environmental policy. The situation is more questionable when it comes to the protection of social and human rights, simply due to the limited competencies at EU level to formulate common rules and to intervene in national practices. While the EU's role in pushing binding rules at EU or international level is well covered in the literature, we suggest that we know much less about the environmental and social footprint of the EU's global economic activities and the degree to which the EU assumes responsibility in this regard. In our article, we hope to fill this gap. We focus on the EU's impact on global deforestation, and largely to illustrate matters, we zoom in on the soy and beef supply chain from Brazil to Europe. The EU as a trading bloc is the leading international consumer of deforestation embodied in trade, and the soy and beef supply chain from Brazil together account for the majority of imported deforestation. Besides the environmental and climate change related effects, the global soy and beef supply chains can also be linked to human rights violations at the production sites. With this background in mind, it is interesting that the EU and previously some member states is in the progress of extending its regulatory activities to cover these global supply chains, effectively trying to hold corporations into account for their environmental and social footprints abroad.
In this figure, you can see the important milestones in the drafting processes of the new regulation on forest risk commodities and the directive on human rights and environmental due diligence. In 2011, the United Nations General Principles on Business and Human Rights were adopted, and therein due diligence was established as a key concept. The general principles outline that states should use a smart mix of voluntary and obligatory regulations for their implementation. However, there is clear evidence that voluntary measures have been insufficient, which is why the demand for mandatory measures has become stronger. Hence, in several EU member states and at EU level, due diligence laws have been adopted or are currently under discussion. In the case of the laws we focus on here, EU institutions already published comprehensive studies, organized public consultations, and the EU Parliament voted in favor of a legislative initiative and a resolution for adopting stringent new laws. While mandatory due diligence has been widely understood as a particularly promising solution for tackling the severe problems associated with global commodity chains, our research sheds light on persisting challenges that merit further attention by scholars and policymakers. For organizing our analysis, we refer to Mayshaw's questions to analyze accountability regimes, and to the three key concepts of input, output, and surrogate accountability. While there has been a broad acceptance to establish mandatory due diligence regulations at the EU level, a closer look at these processes reveals that under the surface of a general agreement, many important institutional design features and enforcement measures need yet to be defined and are highly contested. While civil society actors, leftist and green parties have supported more comprehensive and stringent regulation, business actors, conservative and liberal parties have generally pushed for less stringency and enforceability. The decisions taken will be decisive for the question to what extent new legislation will harden the accountability of companies for any negative impacts caused abroad. For instance, it is still unclear who is being held to account. Will it only be very large companies, like in the case of the French duty of vigilance law? Will it only be companies headquartered in an EU member state? Or will it be any company putting products on the EU market? Such decisions regarding the scope of due diligence regulations are of crucial importance for supply chains from Brazil, as, for instance, the largest traders of soy from Brazil to the EU are all headquartered in the United States. Then, to give another example, what happens when the agent fails to meet these standards? The question of the actual enforcement of future regulations and the legal liability of corporations has been the most important or the most contested one in the ongoing policymaking processes. It still needs to be decided whether new EU laws will establish legal liability, and if they do, what kind of liability. For example, will new laws establish criminal liability, civil liability, or only administrative fines? Furthermore, previous research into court cases on extraterritorial duties of corporations has discussed the practical challenges emerging in such complex transnational cases. Hence, open questions are who will have legal standing in court cases, and will there be measures for easing the burden of proof? The existence of measures for easing the burden of proof for victims like local communities or indigenous peoples from Brazil would be important to guarantee their access to remedy. To sum up, we find that input accountability, in our case, a stringent institutional design of mandatory due diligence measures, is a necessary condition for hardening foreign corporate accountability. Transparency is key for evaluating the adequacy of due diligence systems. Furthermore, we assume that there can be different paths contributing to enforceability or output accountability. Among them, first, strong social forms of accountability, including stakeholder involvement from actors from the sites of production, like different regions from Brazil in our case. Second, rigorous state supervision. And third, legal liability to sanction any breaches of due diligence obligations. Future research will need to reveal how transparency rules and legal avenues will unfold in practice, in diverse contexts and sectors, and to what extent new laws actually contribute to environmental sustainability and human rights protection.